Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here with Dr. Michael Licona from Houston Christian University. Dr. Licona, it's so great to have you on. I know that you've talked about how Dale Allison is just this exemplar of, scholarly integrity, but I definitely think that I felt the same thing from you. And so, I mean, once again, it's an honor, it's a blessing to have you. And also, it's early in the morning for you. So I appreciate you being up to talk to this lowly graduate student of the New Testament.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your gracious and uh, I don't know. I feel humbled by your comment there. Thank you so much, Suan. I appreciate it.
Mhm. And Dr. Licona, you run the Risen Jesus podcast, and you have a YouTube channel, I think by the same name, if I'm not mistaken. You've had guests on there from Lee Martin McDonald to various other scholars. Could you maybe talk a little bit about your work and your podcast, or anywhere else we can find you?
Yeah, actually, I didn't enjoy the podcast. People were after me to do it, and we did several seasons, and
Mhm.
thought they went pretty well, but there wasn't a whole lot of traffic on it, so I just lost interest in it. So I haven't done the Risen Jesus podcast for a few years, although I still get comments from people who are listening to past episodes and really enjoying it. I hate social media. I just hate it. I just enjoy research, writing, lecturing, debating is fun, but I don't enjoy the social media stuff. But occasionally we're making videos. Our social media team, I have a social media team, a contractor, and they'll break up a number of my other videos and make smaller ones out of it. And that's who's doing the ones that are currently going on YouTube. But our channel is getting some really good um, traffic to it. Over 1 million views a year.
Wow.
I mean, that's not what a lot of other people are getting, but I mean, still 1 million views plus a year is pretty cool.
Mhm.
You just go to Dr. Mike Licona, youtube.com/Dr. Mike Licona, or just type in my name, Mike Licona, and my channel will pop up.
Mhm.
We have over 500 videos on it. And
Wow.
yeah.
And if I may ask, what are you currently working on? I'm very curious. Or is that a
Yeah. Well,
secret?
in 2017, Oxford University Press published a book that um, I, I and many others thought is a groundbreaking approach to understanding why the Gospels tell the same story differently.
Mhm.
And in fact, Christopher Pelling, the foremost authority in the world on Plutarch, called it an exemplary cross-disciplinary study or work. Broke new ground with some things with Plutarch, broke new ground with some things with the Gospels. And what's pretty cool was as I lecture about this here in the US as well as all over the world, I began to have people say, hey, can you write a version, put the cookies on the lower shelf for those of us who aren't so academically inclined. And at first, I just didn't want to do it because I'd already moved on to my next research, which had to do with the historical reliability of the Gospels from a fresh perspective. But when I was getting so many people asking for this, I decided to do it. And so Zondervan Academic is publishing this book. It is scheduled to come out May 28th of next year, which will be, I guess that's late Memorial Day weekend here in the US.
Mhm.
And they're really excited about this book, what they're projecting to be the book that is, if what they're projecting is true, to be the book that has sold far more copies in its first year than any other book that I've ever written.
Wow.
And I'm really excited about it. And Zondervan is doing a great job. It's already ready they got it for pre-ordering it on Amazon. I like the cover that they have for it. They're getting ready for the camera ready copies. It's going to be released not only in hardcover with dust jacket,
Hmm.
but also in audio format
Oh, wow.
on a standalone video course that we recorded up in Grand Rapids at Zondervan this past July. Kindle version, and then shortly after that it's going to come out on Logos Bible software. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Wow, congratulations. So I mean that's basically the subject of our conversation today, which is going to be about why there are differences in the Gospels. And I'm sure that like from the time you published your book originally in 2016, 2017 to now, maybe you've had like developments in your thinking or new objections and arguments have come in. And so I just want to kind of use the book as a platform or a foundation. And then from there, we can build into, all of your insights up to this point. And so my first question is simply, you talk about Theon of Alexandria's compositional textbooks for understanding the Gospels. And so maybe could you unpack like why do we want to focus on someone like Theon of Alexandria? What's his relevance to the Gospels?
Yeah, well, Theon probably wrote in the 1st century. And so, as you mentioned, he had these compositional textbooks. And what they would do is people in their secondary and tertiary level of education. So they were probably in their mid-teens at this point. They already knew how to read. They already knew how to write. Now they were learning how to write well. And so they would learn these exercises called progymnasmata, or preliminary exercises for writing. And some of that would, how to write a eulogy, how to how to make a case for something, how to write history and things like this. And one of the ways of doing that would be to learn how to paraphrase. You would learn to, as Theon would say, learn to paraphrase your own writings and the writings of others. And he specifically mentions poets and historians, and he says these ways of paraphrasing are used by everyone in every form of writing. So this is pretty neat, because it's like, okay, well, if everyone in every form of writing is using this, well, it would benefit us to take notice of what these techniques are. And they're simple techniques for paraphrasing. It would be things like, changing the word to a synonym, right? Or changing the grammatical structure of something. You might take something that's a subject and make it a direct object, and something that's a direct object would become an indirect object, and so forth. But the sentence would be made to say the same thing. So that was called inflection. Plus inflection, you could actually change a singular to a plural or plural to a singular. We find something like this happening in the Gospels, where Jesus is tempted in the wilderness. And I think it's Luke, where Jesus says, or Satan says to Jesus, if you're the Son of God, change this, you're hungry, change this stone to bread, singular. The word bread in English could be, one loaf, or so, pick up some bread at the grocery store. Well, how many loaves do you want, right? It could be singular or plural. But in Greek, as you know, Suan, studying, it's easy to tell whether it's singular or plural in Greek because of the way things are, the endings are. So in Matthew, it's different. It's changed these stones to bread, plural. So there's all these kinds of differences, things you can do to paraphrase, or you can change a statement to a question, or a question to a command. You could take a teaching and then turn it into a dialogue, which is a lot easier to understand, more fun for us to listen to, a dialogue, than just have someone teach. It's like if I were going to teach on gospel differences, I could lecture on it, but I think most people would enjoy a conversation like you and I are having right now. So you could do some things like that, create a fictitious conversation. We see some of this going on in the Gospels, where just the teaching of Jesus is turned into a very short dialogue that's going on. So we find this kind of stuff going on in the Gospels. We find it going on in Plutarch. And again, Theon says that this is something that it applies to every form of writing, and everyone does it, not only to their own writings, but also to the writings of others.
And then you also highlight another ancient historian, Plutarch. And I mean, some people might say, well, why Plutarch? Because he's a little bit later than, someone like Theon. But, you point out in the various pericopes that he's written that there are parallels that are relevant for understanding the Gospels. And so I want to know, like, okay, moving from Theon then to Plutarch, what can Plutarch tell us about the New Testament, or the Gospels, at least?
Yeah, good question. Well, biography was something that started a couple of centuries before Christ, but it evolved over time. And by the time you get to the first century, it's a little bit different than it was 200 years before Christ. Um, and Plutarch is considered the greatest ancient biographer by many. And he wrote at the end of the first century and into the beginning of the second century. So from around the mid 90s up to just after 120, sometime after that, we're not sure when. And he wrote more than 60 biographies, of which 48 have survived. So he, a lot of times as I was going through these, I started to notice that these biographies feature characters that parallel one another. So, for example, Julius Caesar, Cicero, Pompey, Crassus, Marcus Brutus. These are people who knew one another, and they participated in many of the same events. So when you have Plutarch, let's say, mention the assassination of Julius Caesar, he tells the story in the life of Caesar. In the life of Cicero, he mentions it. In the life of Brutus, because Brutus was one of the conspirators who assassinated Caesar. He tells it, well, in several of them. He's going to tell this story. It's in like, I don't know, 5 of these different biographies. So you've got Plutarch, same writer, using the same sources. And in most cases, he's writing these, according to Christopher Pelling, he's writing several of these simultaneously. So same author using the same sources, writing the same stories simultaneously. So it's probably not any differences that he's coming across new sources.
Right.
And so when you read, I made a catalog of the stories that are told 2 or more times throughout these biographies of Plutarch. In fact, I focused on 9 of them, and I found 36 stories or pericopes that appear on 2 or more occasions. And then I went through them with a fine-tooth comb, and I found that there were differences in 30 of those 36. And so what I did was, Suan, I read these differences in view of the compositional devices of the progymnosmata, the preliminary exercises in the compositional textbooks. And hark, it's like, all right, if you apply these principles of paraphrasing that Theon and Quintilian and others talk about. Quintilian was another one who wrote about these preliminary exercises. He wrote in the latter part of the first century, and he wrote in Latin, whereas Theon wrote in Greek. And Theon says that he is providing some new exercises that others had not given. So Theon is not the first to discuss, to come out with these. He's just the oldest source that we have today that has survived, that mentions them. So when you read these differences in Plutarch between his different biographies, his different lives, in view of these compositional devices, they result in the kind of differences that you find in these 30 pericopes. And then I thought, well, what if we looked at the Gospels in the same way? And so I read the Gospels 9 times in Greek. And as you know, when you read them in Greek, it's not your first language. And so you can't read them as quickly. And they don't have as much the familiarity as if you're reading in your primary language. So it slows you down and really causes you to focus on it. And then you see all kinds of differences that you never noticed before. And so I made a catalog of these, and I came up with more than 50 pages of differences that I found in the Gospels. And so when you start reading these in view of these progymnosmata, preliminary exercises that you find articulated in Theon's compositional textbooks and in Quintilian's work, same stuff. It explains the differences wonderfully. And then also Plutarch did some things that aren't explained by Theon. And he did it on a consistent basis. And when you come to the Gospels and you read the Gospel differences in view of some of these other techniques that Plutarch used, it's like, hark, the gospel authors are doing the same thing Plutarch, because, well, Plutarch's writing later. It's like Plutarch's doing the same thing that the gospel authors were doing. And so these must also have been some compositional devices that were used back then. And in fact, you've got people like the late J.L. Moles, as well as others, and Pelling, that says these kind of compositional devices like compression, displacement, conflation, transferal, things like this.
Mm-hmm.
These are used and nearly universally in ancient writings. And it's like, wow, okay, well, if this is the case, we should expect the gospel authors to do it. In fact, we should be surprised if we do not notice them doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we come to them and we read the gospel differences in view of these compositional devices. And it seems like this is exactly what they're doing. So what does this mean? And maybe you were going to ask that, and I'm sorry for the longer answer, but it's like,
no, you're fine.
What does this mean? Well, it has implications for both skeptic and the pious Christian as well. So for the skeptic, it's who appeals to gospel differences and says, we can't trust the gospels because they're full of errors. They contradict one another so many times. It's like, no, these aren't contradictions. They're compositional devices. And we have to read them through the lens of first century biography. And when we do that, a whole lot more comes into focus. It's reading them through the lens of 21st century biography that you look and you say, contradiction. But it's anachronistic thinking. We need to update our thinking in view of what we're finding and learning today. And then for the Christian, for the pious Christian, it's like, we can think that we believe that the scriptures are divinely inspired, but what does that mean? And how did it occur? Scripture does not tell us how it occurred. And even most evangelicals will say, well, it wasn't divine dictation.
Right.
But they still believe, and I'm an evangelical Christian, but a lot of evangelical Christians, scholars even though they will say it wasn't divine dictation, the way they believe that Scripture, what they believe it is today, is hard to distinguish from divine dictation. And so if we are coming to the Gospels and reading them as though they preserve descriptions of the events like a transcript of a legal deposition, we're going to be disappointed, because that is not what we have. The Gospels we have give us an essentially, not a blow-by-blow photographic description of what occurred and what Jesus said. They give us an essentially faithful representation of what occurred.
I mean, Dr. Licona, this reminds me, I think we might talk about this down the line, so maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit. But I know that you've talked about kind of using popular examples of like the guy version of the story versus the girl version of the story. I really like that analogy. And even yesterday, I was hearing a friend of mine tell a story about he talked to like this middle-aged man, and this middle-aged man was like going to go see one of his like old high school friends. And my friend met this middle-aged man at a party, and he told the story one way to one group, and I listened to him, and he said, yeah, this guy told me for 15 minutes the story about him meeting his old friend. And then he went to another group, and I heard him tell the same story, and he said, oh yeah, and like I talked to him for like 15 minutes and he said the story. And somebody could say, well, okay, look, he's contradicting himself, or those are two totally different things. But I mean, it's a kind of shorthand that he's doing. And I mean, the 15 minutes is a generally consistent theme. So something happened for 15 minutes, but it's not like my friend is being intentionally deceptive. He might be a little loose with the words. He could tighten it up a bit. But then again, this is, for crying out loud, a casual conversation. We're not trying to be academic historians all the time when we're talking and communicating with people. I mean, that would be kind of miserable, Mike.
No, I agree with you. That's a good example you provided. Now, of course, someone may respond, a real conservative Christian might respond and say, yeah, but that's a casual conversation. We're talking about the Word of God.
Right.
And so we would expect for it to be precise. And to that, I would respond, why? Are you imparting 21st century conventions for writing biography on first century minds?
Mm.
And I would contend that even in 21st century, biographers aren't being concerned with that kind of accuracy in most cases.
Sure.
So one illustration I've given over time is, I've got a watch that my parents gave me for Christmas in 1979. It's a Seiko watch, and it's fairly accurate. It might be off a half a minute a day. Is that a reliable watch? Is it giving me a reliable and accurate, is it keeping accurate time? Well, how do I answer that? Well, if I'm looking at, let's say I'm going to have this video interview with Suan, and we're going to do this at 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning. Yeah, it's plenty accurate for that. If I'm 30 seconds or even a minute or 2 minutes off, it's still reliable enough to get the job done. But if I'm working for SpaceX and I have to launch a rocket at a specific second, I'm not going to, that Seiko watch is not reliable. So the thing is, when we're talking about ancient history reporting, can we say that the guy version of the story, which, men will often take liberties in the way they repeat a story, more inclined to do so than women? Of course, I'm stereotyping here, right? There are plenty of exceptions. I know of guys who give us a very detailed, lengthy, and it makes me want to pound my head on the wall and saying, get to the bottom line. I don't care about all these other details, right? But they do. My wife is that way. She wants all the details, and everything has to be just right. Everything has to be just right. Well, that's what we call the girl version of the story, right? Because typically speaking, women want more details than guys. We just want to get to the bottom line. So that's not, I'm not saying that in a pejorative way, the girl version versus guy version. I'm not saying one is better than the other. It's just different ways of telling the story.
Right. And I mean, sometimes you might, if you want the fuller context in the story, right, you might get the girl version, but that isn't to necessarily say that there's anything wrong with the guy version of the story. And then with the Gospels, you kind of point out that like Mark's very, quick and to the point, and then he moves on quite fast, whereas other Gospels might spend more time on a particular event. And so we can say like,
that's true, but sometimes Mark spends more time on it.
Sure. And so we can use them together synoptically to find like the fuller, bigger picture. Then there's not a problem with that. Lest we say that any testimony from a perspective is necessarily unreliable, and then that's just too extreme. Anyway, Dr. Licona, when are compositional devices valid and invalid for explaining gospel differences? What's the limiting principle?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know how to answer that, to be honest with you. There are some things, some devices that the gospel authors use, especially Matthew. He probably takes us to the limits of what would probably be allowable.
Sure.
Things like composite citations. Well, they all do it. Like Mark does it at the beginning of his gospel. He says, as Isaiah the prophet says, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Well, if I remember correctly, he's quoting first from Malachi, and then he quotes from Isaiah, but he quotes the whole thing as a composite citation, as a single citation, and attributes the whole thing to Isaiah. It'd be kind of like us saying, oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light, my country 'tis of the sweet land of liberty. And then saying, this is the Pledge of Allegiance in the U.S. Well, I've combined the first statements of the Star Spangled Banner with the Pledge of Allegiance and attributed the whole thing to Pledge of Allegiance. So you had those. What Matthew, probably the one that takes this to the brink and really stretches the limits here. And by the way, not just Christians in the first century, but also Jews and Greco-Roman authors did composite citations. They also repurposed texts to say things or to apply them in certain ways to be addressing things that were foreign to its original context. So
right.
in Matthew, you've got the text in Matthew 27, I think it's verses 9 and 10, where Judas throws the 30 pieces of silver in the temple. And he says, this was to fulfill what the prophet Jeremiah said. And then he provides a quote. Well, if you go to Jeremiah, you will be hard pressed to find that quote. And that's because it's in Zechariah. And the context in which this applies, and it would take too long to unpack here. I do unpack it in my new book coming out, but it's not even referring to Judas in that original context. It's something completely foreign. So why does he attribute it to Jeremiah? Well, Jeremiah, there's another context that involves some silver coins, but it's not 30 pieces of silver. I think it's 17 shekels, if I recall correctly, a different context. And Jeremiah uses it to buy a field. But what happens is Matthew has taken the word field from this context. It's 30 pieces of silver is what they gave to Zechariah. And then he gave them to the potter who was the treasurer. Well, the Greek word used there for gave it to them is balo or ekbalo. I think it's ekbalo. No, it's balo to mean throw. But it doesn't mean throw in the sense that we use it, like throw, like Judas threw the 30 pieces. It just means to throw them. He gave them to the treasurer who was a potter at that time. So what Matthew has done is taken the word field and put it in the Jeremiah text and then the Zechariah text, and then gave this very, very loose rephrasing of the whole Jeremiah text to apply this to Judas throwing 30 pieces of silver in the temple, and then saying scripture has been fulfilled.
Wow.
It's something that we would throw a pastor out of his church today if he did something like that with the text. But this is something that Christians would do in the first century. It's something that Jewish authors would do. It's something that Greco-Roman authors would do. So this was something that was not anathema for the ancients to do. This is kind of like what I would find to be the limits of these kinds of things. We wouldn't do it today, but they did it back then. And again, we got to judge things based on how they follow the rules of their day rather than forcing an idea of modern precision upon them.
Well, Dr. Licona, another question I want to ask you is, when is a harmonization valid? You've talked about how sometimes some people, actually, that's my next question, so I'll hold off on that. Or maybe let me combine these two. Let me do a compositional, or, to combine these two questions together. So when is a harmonization valid, and when might a harmonization seem like a stretch? You've talked about how some people might waterboard a text. And so how do I avoid doing that?
Well, I think a good way to harmonize, a good example of when it's appropriate to harmonize a text is, say, the story of Jesus before Pilate. And where, the Barabbas story and all this and everything that's happening when Jesus is before Pilate. You have Luke that mentions some things that none of the others do, like Pilate sending Jesus to Herod. You've got a couple things that are said, like in one gospel that's not said in another, like Luke. Pilate asked Jesus, "So are you a king?" And Jesus says, "You say that I am." And that was just a way of saying, "You bet, buddy." And the very next statement that Pilate says in Luke comes out and he says, "I find no fault in this man." Now, what? He just claimed to be a king, and you're saying you find no fault in it? What? That you would have killed someone like that. But when you read the fuller story in John's gospel, Jesus explains that his kingdom is not of this world, and so forth. And just given the whole tenor of that fuller conversation that John reports, well, it's just that there Luke is giving us the guy version of what happened. He's not giving us every detail.
Sure.
And now Luke's version makes a whole lot more sense in view of John's version. Plus the difference in wording between what's going on in these accounts at Jesus and Jesus before Pilate seems to suggest that the authors are using some different traditions here. They're compatible, and I think they can be harmonized and should be harmonized. But so that's a good example, I think,
Right.
where harmonization is good. A bad example, I think, where like, for example, Jesus healing the centurion's son. Or servant. So you have in Luke's gospel, the centurion sends some Jewish leaders,
Right.
and he says, "Look, these the centurion's a really great guy. He helped us build our synagogue. He loves our people. He's got a servant who's sick. Please come heal him." And Jesus says, "All right, let's go." So he heads toward the centurion's house, and then the centurion becomes a little fearful, and he sends some friends out, and he says, "Look, I'm unworthy to have you come under my house, but look, I'm a man of authority, so I understand that you are too. And just like I tell servants, do this and they do it, and a soldier, do this and go, and they do it and they go. Look, you're a man of authority, just say the word and my servant will be healed." And so the friends report that to Jesus, and Jesus praises the centurion for his faith and heals his servant without ever seeing the centurion or his servant. In Matthew, the centurion himself goes to Jesus,
Right,
and makes the request. And Jesus says, "All right, let's go." And the centurion says, No. I'm unworthy for you to come, yada, yada. And Jesus praises the centurion and heals the servant from afar without ever seeing him. Some have tried to harmonize this by saying, well, the centurion sent the Jewish elders, then he sent the friends, and then he had a change of heart. He says, "Well, I'm just going to go myself." And so he goes. But when you look at the Greek in Luke, that's not what's going on, because in Luke, Jesus says to them who the centurion had sent. He said to them, plural, go, plural. It will be done as, the centurion wants, as he said. So the thing is, he's speaking to them in the plural, not the singular, whereas if it were the centurion, he'd be speaking in the singular. And there are other reasons as well. But I think that's just a case of forced harmonization.
Right.
It just doesn't need to be that way. When you look at this in view of a compositional device, which would be a simplification and transferal, there's just no problem here. And this is the kind of stuff we do in our everyday, ordinary conversations. We think nothing of it. We don't think we're trying to deceive a person, like you were saying. It's just, this is the way we communicate.
If I could use maybe my favorite example, which is, how many women were at the tomb. One gospel seems to just highlight or spotlight Mary Magdalene. And then eventually, she comes back and says, "We have seen, right, the risen Lord." And then it's like, oh, wait, it's in the plural. So it implies that there are other women there. It's not just the gospel writers kind of, losing their brains for a moment. And then, whoops, they, I don't know, made it plural for some reason, the first person plural. You can piece together how many women were at the tomb. Dr. Licona, I'm interested, before I get into my last two questions, do you have any thoughts about how many times the temple was cleansed? Was it once or twice?
I haven't studied that a whole lot.
Sure.
I am fine with saying it was cleansed once, and that John has displaced the cleansing from its original chronological location and transplanted it at the beginning of Jesus's ministry. This is something Craig Keener has posited. Well, most scholars think that that's what happened. Darrell Bach thinks that what's happened. Craig Keener explains it as John wants to frame the entirety of Jesus's ministry as a Passover, because Jesus is our Passover lamb.
Right.
So he does this, cleanses the temple during Passover at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and then he dies as the Passover lamb.
Right.
Toward the end. But Randy Richards has written an article. I respect Randy as a scholar. He's done some fantastic stuff. Randy did some groundbreaking work back in the 90s in his doctoral dissertation on the secretary in Paul's letters, and shows that, hey, I mean, the payoff for this is, you say, when the gospel authors, people say, well, you couldn't have had a fisherman like John write the gospel, or a tax collector like Matthew write the gospel of Matthew. Both of these have a lot of artistic, the way it's artistically composed, especially Matthew. Would a tax collector be able to do this? Would a fisherman be familiar with all the philosophical concepts like the logos that we find in John? Well, I mean, yeah, it's possible, but it seems to me more probable that they would have had an amanuensis or a secretary who was more familiar with these things, who they told their story to. The secretary took notes, composed it, and then Matthew and John either read it or had it read to them, and then they suggested adaptations or edits, and then approved the final thing before it went out and was published. I have no problem with that whatsoever. I mean, that seems entirely plausible to me. I mean, Paul certainly used an amanuensis, a secretary. In 3 of his letters, he ends it with the precise wording, I, Paul, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. Or I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand, which means he didn't write the rest of it. He said, well, maybe he just dictated it. Well, I don't know. That dictation, when they're writing so slowly with the kind of writing utensils that they had back then, it wasn't a quick thing. And then you've got Tertius in Romans 16:22, where he says, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. Well, wait a minute. I thought Paul wrote it because that's who he says. Yeah, but Tertius says he did in the end. And it is so much a better and sophisticated letter than anything else Paul wrote. Tertius had to do a whole lot more than just take dictation there. Paul typically has a lot of run-on sentences, anakaleuthon, where he changes the point. He never gets back to the original point. Cicero, one of the most highly educated people in the Roman Empire, he had an amanuensis, a secretary named Tiro. And on one occasion, Pompey was over for dinner, and he asked Cicero to read something. And Cicero wrote to Tiro, who was recuperating from an illness, and he says, I refused to do so because I said, without Tiro, I am altogether dumb. So he relied on Tiro to take his work and to make it pop, to make it really good. So if Cicero and Paul can do this, and they're highly educated, why wouldn't the gospel authors, even perhaps Luke, as a physician, done the same thing? So I think, here I went on anakaleuthon and off on a rabbit trail here. Randy Richards did some great work in talking about the role of secretaries, and really solves a lot of the difficulty about the traditional authorship of the Gospels. But yeah, so Randy Richards has done this thing. He wrote an article. Darn, I went off on this long rabbit trail, and I try not to do this. I'm trying to get out of that. But Randy Richards wrote an article a few years ago. I haven't read it yet, but he argues that there were 2 temple cleansings and the plausibility of it. Again, I haven't read it yet. I respect Randy. It might be true that there were 2. Presently, without reading that, I'm still inclined to think that there was 1, but I'm open to 2.
I think I saw a quote somewhere. Don't quote me on this. I think it was D.A. Carson who said that if there was a second temple cleansing, nobody would have expected it. So, I mean, you could get away or make sense of a second temple cleansing. He did it the first time. Nobody thought he'd do it again, and he did it again. And so he was able to do it twice. I mean, that's a possibility. Okay, yeah. Dr. Licona, my last 2 questions. So first is, you've talked in the past about how inerrancy should be understood flexibly. And you mentioned this a bit earlier. And so obviously, I think a lot of people would agree that the New Testament isn't a direct transcript, because if it really was, then you have to, like even minor differences in spelling or verbiage is just going to be totally collapsing. And so I wanted to ask you, what does inerrancy mean to you?
That's a good question. I'm going to be reading a paper on this at the annual meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society this year. And I have a whole chapter of this on inspiration and another chapter on inerrancy in my forthcoming book with Zondervan.
Nice.
And my guess is that it's going to raise quite a stink. I don't like that, but I do think we really have to rethink what we mean by inspiration and what we mean by inerrancy. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay.
We can talk about it more after I deliver my paper in November, but I don't want to give the goods away right now.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, but I'd love to have you back on. All right, here's my last question. So in your numerous debates with Bart Ehrman, you've talked about sometimes how the Gospels essentially retain the gist of like the story. There might be some minor variations here, but the gist, the core is there. And I think a lot of people would agree with you. But I remember Bart wasn't satisfied with that, the gist. What do you mean by that? And so I wanted to ask you, how would you address somebody who thinks that when you talk about the gist of the story, that's too loose, it's not and undefined?
Well, I acknowledge just can mean a couple of different things. In other words, there's a spectrum of what we mean by gist, right?
Yeah.
It can be something that's just really, really loose. And on the other hand, if you look at the definition of it in the dictionary, we really might not have any problem with it if we look at how it's formally defined. So that's why I'd like to say, if I say it gives us the gist of what occurred, an essentially faithful representation. I think to say essentially faithful representation is more understandable in that sense.
Right.
So let's go back to the story of the Jesus healing the centurion servant. Did the centurion himself go to meet Jesus, or did he send emissaries and then friends? My guess is that B is the case. He sent the emissaries, the Jewish leaders, and then the friends. And that Matthew has simplified the story by just having the centurion go. Both stories give us an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. We get the gist of what happened, but whether the centurion himself went in person or sent people, we understand what was happening. The centurion made a request of Jesus, whether it was through him directly or through emissaries. You got these differences in the stories, but he made the request of Jesus, and Jesus healed his servant without having to see the servant. So that's what I would mean by the gist, or an essentially faithful representation.
Well, Dr. Licona, those are the questions that I have for you today. And once again, I appreciate you joining me early in the morning on your side of things. And I have an exegetical paper to work on after this. And so it's nice at least to talk to an exegete scholar. And maybe some of that inspiration from you will emanate into my work. But Dr. Licona, thank you once again.
Well, thank you, Suan. It's just a pleasure talking with you again. Anytime, my friend.